Hello and welcome to the Out of Frame Behind the Scenes podcast. As you can tell, we got a little bit different of a setup today. Sean isn't able to join us for this episode or next week, so we are going to be missing him. But as always, we still have Jen Mafasanti in beautiful Utah and myself, Paul Nelson, here in studio in Atlanta, Georgia. How are you doing, Jen?
I am cold. Everybody's cold right now, but
Yeah.
I got more snow yesterday morning than I had the entire decade that I lived in Georgia. It was pretty impressive to see it come down, actually.
How many snow forts have your sons built?
No snow forts. The occasional snowball fight, and they have finally discovered sledding. They've never had the opportunity to go sledding before, and now they have, and they're all about it.
Has the conversation come up about snowboarding or skiing?
Uh, Not really. Not in any kind of real sense. They're still adjusting to the temperature change, so they
Yeah.
get colds very easily.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that they're super excited about the idea of just being outside all day in the winter here, yet. I imagine that will change
Yeah,
probably
they'll come
next
around to
year,
it.
though. They'll
Yeah,
come
I'm sure.
around to it.
It's like those used kids you see going to school and they got like the shorts on and it's like, why are you wearing shorts? It's 20 degrees. Oh, no, it's not. It's fine.
Yeah, there are definitely those people here, and okay.
Yeah.
It takes all kinds, I guess, but I am not that kind.
Me neither. I had a work trip a few years ago where I went to Minneapolis in late November and it was low 20s, which for them apparently was a warm streak. So we walked out of our hotel at 6:30 a.m. and I'm bundled up head to toe, and there's people going to work just wearing a sweater, no
A
earmuffs, nothing.
balmy 22 degrees Fahrenheit.
And I'm like, I never get used to this. So here I am in Georgia, and it's cold out today, cold and rainy, and Florida's sounding pretty nice right now. So
Right?
yeah,
Goodness.
have you been watching
But
anything
because,
interesting lately?
well, in celebration of the cold weather, my husband Andrew and I decided that it was finally time to show the kids Home Alone, the first
Nice.
one. And we immediately regretted that decision because now the boys are just running around with their Nerf guns, just firing darts at each other willy-nilly and shouting out, "Keep the change, you filthy animal." So that's my life right now.
Seems like the natural progression.
I know, right? But thankfully, we did watch some YouTube videos from Mark Rober and Vsauce3 on whether or not the Home Alone shenanigans were actually survivable. And it turns out that they're not. And
No.
since the kids are super into science, that was really effective. And I don't think I have to worry about paint cans anytime
Yeah.
soon. But still, constant vigilance.
Yes. Always keep your head on a swivel.
Exactly.
So on a probably 180-degree turn from the fun romp of Home Alone, we are talking about Judas and the Black Messiah. It's a new movie that is one of the movies that Warner has released on HBO Max as well as theaters, and it came out a couple weeks ago. And it's an interesting idea. It's one of the first times I think that the Black Panthers have been portrayed on screen in a major motion picture, from what I could tell. And it tells a story of the betrayal of Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party in late 60s Chicago. And William O'Neill, who is played by a wonderful Lakeith Stanfield, who turned from a petty crook to an FBI informant. And this is based off true events. And while they took a lot of liberties with the story, as you would expect, it is a little bit of an interesting look into that time period in a very specific place about how the U.S. government interacted with a very radical group of people. So with that setup, I wanted to get your thoughts on this because there's a lot of ideas that we can dive into with this movie.
Before we get into the meat of the actual ideas, I just want to go ahead and say that this movie was wonderfully cast and exquisitely acted. It is a high quality film, and even though it is tough to watch, like it is uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I, it was a high quality film.
You're
Uh,
exactly right. Daniel
so,
Kaluuya played Fred Hampton, the chairman, and
mhm,
you would recognize him from his role in Black Panther. And like I said, Lakeith Stanfield played the rat, but
mhm.
he's been all over the place from Selma, Straight Outta Compton, the TV show Atlanta, which I think he's probably my favorite character in that show. But his acting performance in this movie it should earn him a nomination at least for best supporting actor, or maybe even I think this is one of my complaints with who is the lead, who is the supporting actor.
Yeah,
But it was regardless, it was a wonderful performance.
it really was. Not a whole lot by way of sympathetic characters in this film, though.
No, not
Um,
at all.
in fact, there weren't really any.
Yeah,
If I'm being real honest.
it was interesting because you're with William O'Neill, Lakeith Stanfield's character, you're made to feel is he all in on the Black Panther ideology, or is he just playing the part? And on the flip side, the Fred Hampton character, they really play up the sympathetic side of him while kind of touching on the very violent aspects of his beliefs and what he was doing at that time. Meanwhile, you got an FBI agent played by Jesse Plemons, full eyes. What's the Friday Night Lights? He played a kicker in Friday Night Lights, and that's the only thing I remember him from. But
Yeah.
and he's kind of caught between his personal beliefs and J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And while everyone is just kind of making terrible decisions, you kind of see where they're coming from and why they think they're making the right decisions from their point of view.
Yeah. Absolutely everything that everybody does makes perfect sense for their characters. You understand their motivations very clearly, and because of that, all of their decisions make sense. That said, that doesn't mean that they're not terrible decisions, because they really, really are. Um, but when you have a whole worldview that's built on a certain kind of foundation that itself is faulty, then your end conclusions are not going to be correct or moral or even all that effective, at least not in the way that you originally hoped. And then you find yourself at the end of all of this having told yourself the entire journey that the ends justify the means, and only to discover that the means have become the ends.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to kind of going off of that, I want to get into what the state of affairs were like in this time period in the 1960s. This movie happens after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and that plays a pretty big role in a lot of the decisions that are being made. So, Jen, do you want to dive into what was happening in this time frame and why these different characters were converging on this specific area?
Yeah. So at this point in time, we're talking like 1968, 1969,
Mm-hmm.
thereabouts. Malcolm X has been killed. Martin Luther King Jr. has been killed. Those were the two leading charismatic leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States. And the federal government was terrified that another charismatic leader, another quote unquote black messiah, to use the term that Hoover used in the film, would arise. and take up the cudgel, as it were, and continue on with this grand civil rights movement that was going on in the United States. So they zero in on Fred Hampton as the candidate, the most likely candidate to take the place of Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, now that they are no longer around, because he is charismatic and he is compelling, and people followed him. He was young. We forget how young this guy was. He was 21.
Yep.
When he died?
Was when he was killed.
So that means he's been doing this since he was a teenager. And to be able to get grown men and women from the horrible streets of Chicago to follow you at that age, you have to have something inside you that just cannot be taught. And that was Fred Hampton.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very compelling guy, and they were terrified that he was going to actually succeed at what he was trying to do. And it was a strange combination of Black nationalism, but also communism. Like, they blended the two together, and that was incredibly appealing to the extremely poor Black people and Hispanic people and otherwise disenfranchised people in Illinois and across the United States. And it also really helped their cause that the US federal government was so adamantly opposed to communism. And the federal government represented everything that these people were fighting against. And so, since communism was the federal government's number one enemy, then that means that they should definitely embrace it.
Yeah. He at the beginning of the movie, he goes through and says, gives all these examples. You don't fight this with the same thing. You fight it with something of its opposite. So you don't fight capitalism with capitalism. You fight capitalism with socialism. And that's kind of where the movie starts and kind of gets Fred Hampton's ideas to the forefront of the movie at the very beginning. And I kind of want to talk a little bit more about his ideas, because it is a driving force for a lot of the action in the movie. Because Hoover doesn't see him as just a violent gang member or anything like that. Like you said, he has these ideas that we are shown throughout the movie, reaches across political divides, reaches across racial divides. One scene in the movie, Fred Hampton walks into a congregation of white people that have a Confederate flag on the wall, and they join forces to go after the same pigs, as they call the cops in their terms. So you have this guy that can whip up a crowd, but also has these ideas that are very scary to the people of the time. And I mean, anytime, honest, socialism is not a great idea. But I found myself being like, you're right. The people are being left behind. They are being forgotten. But the thought of, well, socialism will fix it. It just seems like it's you think just the wrong people are in power. You want to be the ones controlling who is oppressed and who isn't. And that's what it's kind of seen, because he keeps bringing up Che Guevara and people like that. And you saw what happened in Cuba, and they had so many misconceptions of what Cuba was, and I guess still is today. But to think that we're going to solve this with violence and then we're going to come out on top and then everything will be fine, just really doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And the historical evidence does not back up Hampton's point of view, even at the beginning of the movie, when he's talking about you don't fight capitalism with Black capitalism. Well, that's kind of exactly what people did. And it was wildly successful. So successful, in fact, that it was not allowed to continue.
Yep.
Um, we talk, you look back and you think about Black Wall Street
Mm-hmm.
and the Tulsa race riots that kind of burned that one to the ground. And then you have a lot of Black Wall Streets all over the country in the early part of the 20th century. And they were so successful and so effective that through fear of Black people taking over America, because racism is awful,
Mm-hmm.
um, those institutions were either taken apart through legislation and law enforcement, or they were physically taken apart, like they were burned to the ground, like they were in Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
And that's heart wrenching. Like that is awful. It makes me sick to my stomach every time I think about it. Uh, but that doesn't mean that those institutions weren't effective. You know, if they weren't effective, they wouldn't have roused such a strong reaction from racists at the time.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And it it really, I think what this movie gets pretty well, and for me, the takeaway is that violence really isn't the answer, because while you have this government and this Chicago Police Department that is wildly corrupt and is violent, reacting with more violence only makes the situation worse. And it really ramps up the tension with cops do something, shake down a restaurant on the corner. Black Panther guy comes in, pulls out a gun, he gets shot, he shoots a cop, and then that just drives so much more of the violence, and it pulls in these people that normally wouldn't be violent people, and they end up doing just terrible, terrible things. And so it really speaks to both sides of the coin. Just the federal government is, I mean, as the fee government, you can only do anything with government through coercive actions, through violence, and that doesn't work most of the time, or even any of the time. And so taking that same idea and thinking that violence is going to do something better, it's frustrating, because it's obviously there were massive inequalities at the time, and things needed to change. And it's a little disconcerting that ideas like that could take hold so easily. But it makes sense that it
Yeah,
does.
yeah, it is upsetting that it's so simple for that to happen. It's also 100% understandable. Like I am philosophically opposed to violence and coercion, really of any kind, and yet I struggle with my temper and the idea of, well, if you would just listen and do what I tell you to do, things would be so much better. That is a natural human impulse. Uh, but the thing of it is, literally every human thinks that way. And we all have differing opinions on what the best thing is, because the best thing for each of us is not the same thing. I mean, we're all broadly striving to achieve the same goals here. We want health and peace and prosperity and a better life for our children, like all of us do. But how we get there and what each of us needs to meet those goals is slightly different from each other. And to think that you could just mandate it and enforce it at the end of a gun is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
I'm at least self-aware enough to know that my
Right.
tyrannical impulses are not effective. But
Yeah.
I guess that's why we have jobs, right?
There you go. And so I kind of want to get into the FBI's role in this. So
Oh
towards the end of the
man.
movie, the stakes, like I said, keep getting ramped up, and they ask Lakeith Stanfield's character to do more and more things to try to get an opening to kill Fred Hampton, and it's interesting because there's a lot of with like the Breonna Taylor stuff. There's a lot of similarities with that, but the FBI and the lengths they went to and the corners they cut. It's a little for me. It's your where this movie just loses me on the ideas is you're portraying the FBI doing all these terrible, terrible things, which they did, but then you're advocating for a system that would put more power into people's like that hands that think they know what's best for you.
Absolutely. And I think the exquisite irony of that whole third act was right before, the FBI raid in the middle of the night. Fred is kind of slated to go back to prison the next day, and they had been considering fleeing to Cuba because apparently Cuba is like the best.
They got the best doctors.
They got the best doctors and all that good stuff. And I get why that's a consideration. Deb is very pregnant at this point. She's pretty close to giving birth. And so that weighs heavily on people's minds when, you get that close to your due date. But it's not true of Cuba that they had the best doctors in the world. They had Soviet doctors at this point, but Cuba was not and is not the kind of peaceful communist utopia that the Black Panthers of Illinois seemed to think that it was. At this point, it's 1969. We're what, a decade into the Castro regime? So we still have Fidel and Raul and Che Guevara still in power there in Cuba. And they are extraordinarily violent and racist and homophobic. And they do not hesitate to surveil, imprison, torture, and kill anybody who doesn't meet their definition of the new communist man there in Cuba. And that includes Black people. So I can understand why that wouldn't be common knowledge in Chicago in 1969. The access to information that people had in the late 60s was just not nearly at the same level that we have today. I can learn more in a 5-second Google search than these guys could with a week of research at the library. But at this point, the Soviet Union has still been around for, 50 years at this point? Half a century. Communism has been reigning supreme in the Soviet Union. We've already had the Holodomor. We've already had just gulags left, right, and center.
China.
It's
the Great Leap
China.
Forward. Yeah.
That was in the 70s.
Was that right after this? Okay. Yeah,
that was in the 70s. But still, that did not end well. I mean, everything communism touches turns to ashes. And beneath those ashes are the bones of humans who didn't have to die.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds pretty on paper. So
yeah. It's definitely, it plays into human nature where, like you were saying earlier, I know what's best, so just listen to me. and I'll take you to the promised land. And speaking of promised lands, the name Judas and the Black Messiah obviously evokes Jesus Christ. And while the beats of the movie very much coincide to the last days of Jesus with I mean, very obviously with Lakeith Stanfield, the rat, getting money from the FBI, and the very last payment he received from the FBI for killing his now friend was a couple $100 and keys to a gas station. And it definitely plays to the silver that Judas got for betraying Jesus. And they portrayed Fred Hampton as the Black Messiah. Obviously, Hoover used those words in the movie, so it really played into that. But there was a Last Supper type of scene towards the end, and for me, the metaphor, I guess, is it's close enough to make sense. People saw Fred Hampton as someone that could lead a lot of people, but I think what really kind of irked me was the differences in beliefs between the two. The Messiah, the Black Messiah, Fred Hampton, used violence and would coerce people to do what he wants with his end goal, with socialism and communism. Meanwhile, Jesus is preaching, turn the other cheek, self-determination. No one on this earth is your king. And you see the difference in effectiveness. 2,000 years later, after one man has died, in a backwater country of the Roman Empire, we're still talking about him. And this is 40 years after the events of this, and not very many people have heard of his name, which is Fred Hampton's name, which is good or bad, but this is a good story to be told just because of how corrupt the government acted. And I have to reel myself back in because it's a little offensive. I get it. I understand where they're coming from. Like I said, the metaphor makes sense, but the ideas that have come from both of them are so wildly different that it was a little frustrating.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I did grow up in the church, and it does kind of get under my skin how heavily filmmakers and storytellers in general lean on the symbolism of the Christ figure. It's just low-hanging fruit. It's easy to do. Basically, everybody knows the story. So it's a real easy shortcut. That doesn't mean that I care for it, though.
Yeah.
I think that humans are a lot more complicated than that. And good characters should be a lot more complicated than that, too. And using just the shorthand of the Messiah, of the long sought for, long awaited savior of mankind, is kind of cheap, and at this point, frankly, cliche. But
yeah. So with all this stuff being said, for me, I really enjoyed. Enjoyed might be the wrong word.
Yeah, enjoyed's not the right word for this movie.
But it's a really good movie, and it's an interesting story. It's a story that has not been told before, and you rarely ever see Black Panthers portrayed in any movie it's specifically about them. And like any characters, there's good and bad with the Black Panther Party. They have these medical facilities that are helping poor people. They're feeding children, while on the other hand, they're shooting cops. So it is a very, very interesting story in an interesting time. And I'm really glad this movie got made, because not only does it put a spotlight on what they were doing and what wrong ideas the Black Panthers had, but also what the FBI was doing. And that wasn't good either, and just as
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, that I fully agree with your take on this. This is not a movie that you like enjoy watching. It's not a popcorn movie, it's not a lighthearted romp, but it is an excellent film, and it tells a very important story that hasn't been told before. I think it has the potential to start a conversation that is very much needed in this country, because it's not just these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. It's just these are the bad guys and these are the more different bad guys.
Yeah.
And they all have good things that they're doing and bad things that they're doing. And the bad things do not eliminate the good things, but the good things don't excuse the bad things. And I think that pretending that only the good things or only the good or only the bad things, rather, existed doesn't do anyone any favors
Right.
in trying to understand where people were at this point in history, and therefore why we are here today
Mm-hmm.
where we are. And like I get it. The simple story is a lot easier to tell, and it's a lot easier to pick our favorite parts about our favorite characters and just run with those. But that is not at all how humans or the world work.
No.
And we are hurting ourselves pretending otherwise. And we cannot move forward as a species, as a society, until we accept that, you know, we all have some culpability here.
Right. And, I really hope this can spark a conversation along the lines of what the FBI did is wrong. And there's obviously some parallels to what's happening in America the past year. But to people on both sides, there's sacred cows of the right and the left. On the right, you got the military, immigration. The government is good at keeping immigration in check. While on the left, you got military's bad. Immigration is broken, but the government can run social programs, all this stuff. And the conversation that I want to have is the FBI is part of our government. So if you think the FBI is corrupt and is fraudulent and is cutting corners, wouldn't it make sense that it's doing that everywhere else? And have those hard conversations about those sacred cows of, the military. Yeah, I understand you want to love the military or soldiers, but you have to. There's going to be fraud. There's going to be abuse, and this flip on the same side with social programs and Medicare and Medicaid. Yeah, you're coming from a good place, but let's have a serious look at these programs and are they effective in their current state across the board? And we usually cannot have that conversation, which is very frustrating for me. But hopefully this movie can spark that conversation, and not just the racial relations in our country, but just something move beyond that of why we got to this point, like you were saying earlier. So final thoughts.
Yeah. Final thoughts. Goodness. I mean, I've talked about my opinions of this film. I watch it, please. It's a great movie, but we talk a lot about intentions, and most of the characters in this movie behaved with good intent. They were trying to accomplish something better than what existed. And then when things didn't go as they planned, well, that wasn't what they meant to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I get that from my kids. But sorry, the lights. We had this problem before. Um, I get that from my kids. When they mess up and they have a disaster, things get broken, things get misplaced. And, yeah, but I wasn't trying to. Well, sweetie, it doesn't matter what you were trying to do. This is what happened. Good intentions do not cancel out bad outcomes. And so if you keep trying to do the same things with good intentions that end up having bad outcomes, you really need to rethink your strategy, because countering violence with violence doesn't solve anything. And from a historical perspective, it is not particularly effective anyway. Peaceful protest and peaceful revolution, the ideas that actually change the way people think and change the way that people look at the world and how they interact with their fellow humans, are far more powerful, far more effective than throwing a punch will ever be. You cannot bludgeon someone into agreeing with you. You can bludgeon them into compliance, but you can't bludgeon them into actually agreeing with you. And I think that is a distinction that was lost on Fred Hampton, and that is a distinction that is lost on a lot of people to this day.
Yeah, no, you're 100% correct. So we'll leave the conversation for the main part of the episode there. Patreons, subscribe stars. I'm not sure what the name is for them.
Supporters of the show.
Supporters of the show. Thank you, Jen. I'm trying. I'm trying with John gone. I'm trying. Supporter of the show will join us for the extra episode. We're going to be talking about some spicy current events. We have some things to say about what has happened in the world the last few weeks. But thank you for joining us so much. Please tell your friends about the show. Leave us a review if you're listening on podcasts. Like our YouTube page and follow us on social media. We got some great content coming out on Twitter and Instagram and soon to be TikTok. And we'd love you to join there. And also, let's continue this conversation in our Discord. Our Discord is growing like crazy. It's amazing. So thank you, everyone that supports the show, either monetarily or just joining in the conversation. We love it. And we really want to get these ideas to as many people as possible. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.